Hey guys, welcome to my first ever YouTube lecture. We're not going to let snow day slow us down, so I'm going to talk about the picture of Dorian Gray, and let's get started. So because you read Dracula back in the fall, you're already a little bit familiar with the Victorian era, turn of the century England, but there are a few more things that need to be pointed out before you start reading the picture of Dorian Gray. Now we all remember this little cutie, Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, and it was because of her great influence over much of the world's culture. It's also important to note that the Industrial Revolution was taking England from a rural society to this fully industrialized modern urban state, and London specifically became this multicultural metropolis, kind of like Sellersburg. Yeah. Actually, don't write that down, it's nothing like Sellersburg. So London's becoming really the first modern urban center, and in particular the expansion of the railroad system enabled Britain to be this hub where they could participate suddenly in the swift and efficient distribution of goods and services and ideas. And because of that, you had all of these things available to you that weren't available to you in the past. So you see this middle and upper class in Victorian society becoming obsessed with luxury items and exotic commodities. Now this is all very well and good, but it came at a high price, because suddenly we were saying, why am I saying we? It's like, were you there, Miss Kaufman? Were you there? No, quit saying we. I've decided I don't like doing this. This is not easy. This is kind of tough. Industrialization led to urbanization, which led to overcrowding in the cities and poor working conditions and living conditions of the lower working class. They were just deplorable. This was a time of great uncertainty because, if you recall, Charles Darwin's theories were being published, and it just shattered people's beliefs in the literal truth of the Bible. Karl Marx coined the Victorians' obsession with luxury as commodity fetishism. And he said because of that, it was going to lead to an uprising of the working class, the lower working class. He said it was, quote, imminent and inevitable. And this all led to, these class distinctions led to a sense of guilt among the middle and upper class in Victorian England. We got to feel better about the fact that we have a whole bunch of stuff, and the lower working class doesn't have a whole bunch of stuff. So we're going to create charities for them, but really to make ourselves feel better. You also might recall that the 1890s saw the birth of psychoanalysis and the birth of modern psychology, in particular a man named Sigmund Freud, who we talked about when you read Dracula. Now Sigmund Freud was interested in researching neurotic symptoms that couldn't be necessarily traced back to, say, biological defects necessarily. He concluded in his research that neuroses came from more our latent fears and desires that we repressed in our subconscious. And this was really central to the discipline of psychoanalysis. The end of an age refers to the closing decade of the Victorian period. And so Victorians were seeing that sharp disconnect between those conservative values of the Victorian era and the new world, marked by post-Darwinism and social injustice and science. And so this contradiction between a conservative moral code and the unsettling realities of everyday life led to a movement toward escapism. And so in this movement toward escapism, you saw shifting gender notions and modern attitudes, new creative artistic styles. Now let's talk about aestheticism and decadence. Aestheticism and decadence were literary and artistic movements. They're kind of used interchangeably, although aestheticism deals mainly with art. It championed artistic excess, and you might hear the phrase associated with it, art for art's sake. Whereas decadence dealt more with literature and with life. It said that art shouldn't be judged on any sort of moral grounds, but instead be judged on its beauty and sophistication and refinement, and how much pleasure one could derive from its design and composition. Now let's talk about that Lord Henry character. He is the mouthpiece of aestheticism and hedonism. Lord Henry is Dorian's mentor, his intellectual mentor, if you will, in the novel. So Lord Henry encourages Dorian to use aesthetic principles as a way of evaluating and experiencing the world. And he teaches him that art should be judged on its beauty rather than be used as any sort of tool for moral education. Lord Henry was what you call a dandy. A dandy, I think you could argue, would be like today's metrosexual. A dandy is a man who places a great amount of importance on physical appearance and etiquette and speech. He values entertainment and recreation over industry and occupation. Very well dressed man of society, and a lot of times you wouldn't really know what that person did for a living, if anything at all. Maybe they inherited some money, maybe they just mooched off the right people, but it was very important for a dandy to always look the part and to always be rubbing elbows with high society. In fact, I'll read a quote from the picture of Dorian Gray about Lord Henry being described as a dandy. And he was a dandy in the sense of, quote, he had set himself to the serious study of the great aristocratic art of doing absolutely nothing. That pretty much nails it. Now my favorite part about the picture of Dorian Gray, and that's hedonism. It's very scary to think about, which I think makes it kind of fascinating. Hedonism is a philosophy where a person's main goal in life should be the pursuit of pleasure, with little to no regard as to consequences or how your behavior affects others and things like that. So you can imagine well, the dangers of living a hedonistic lifestyle. But Lord Henry very much models that for Dorian Gray, and Dorian becomes very fascinated with hedonism and decides to pursue it himself to great consequences, which you'll see as you read. So a hedonist like Lord Henry, like Dorian Gray eventually, would believe that rather than work toward any sort of goal, you should just seek fulfillment by living in the present moment, seek fulfillment through recreation, through sensuality. Carpe diem. It sounds fun, doesn't it? I can't think of any negatives to that kind of lifestyle. Not one. Oh, and I think it's important to point out that this is closely related to narcissism, and we get that term from Narcissus. You might know he found his reflection and fell in love with it. It's easy to do for some of us, if we're not careful. Guys, we're almost there. Let's talk about themes. Well, first of all, you have the idea of a double life, an alter ego. We all have one. Mine is of domestic goddess. So let's talk about Lord Henry. He definitely personifies the whole idea of living a double life. This is a very duplicitous character. He even talks about how marriage forces people to live lives of deception. You go your way, I'll go mine. We ask very few questions of each other. And it forces people to live in secret, because if you're married, you can't really pursue a hedonistic lifestyle, can you? I mean, you want to pursue pleasure as a hedonist, so marriage makes that really difficult. Thus, it forces us to live a lie. The character of Dorian Gray is also a great study in the idea of a double life, because he's living this very hedonistic lifestyle and he doesn't change on the outside, and his portrait is thus taking on the evidence of his lifestyle. The book itself centers on a Faustian theme, and that comes from stories about characters who make deals with the devil. I would give up my soul for eternal life, or I'll make a deal with the devil. Oh, I'd give anything to be young and beautiful forever and ever and ever. Wait, I don't have to make that deal, but you get the idea. And finally, probably the most controversial theme in the novel deals with homosexuality and homoeroticism. Now, this would be a good time to talk about Oscar Wilde himself. Here is Oscar Wilde. Yeah, that's him. Now, people say that he modeled the character of Lord Henry after himself. He acted much the same way, he dressed the same way, he spoke the same way, same mannerisms. Oscar Wilde was a very large man, a very flamboyant man. He dressed extravagantly, crazy fur coats and canes, and dressed in vibrant colors. Oscar Wilde was the person everyone wanted at their dinner table. Oscar Wilde was the guy who everyone wanted at their party. Very, very witty, sharp, brilliant, funny, and controversial figure. Now, he published the picture of Dorian Gray in 1890 in a magazine, and the problem is that it was met with really harsh reviews about the homoeroticism in the novel, and people called it vulgar and disgusting, and so it got him in some hot water, and so his publishers forced him to make some changes. And it is said that a lot of those changes the publishers themselves made, and Oscar Wilde didn't have the opportunity to okay those changes. But a year later, in 1891, it was published for a second time, and that's the edition that you're reading. So it's a little bit censored. Over the years, students have asked me what the difference is between his first publication of Dorian Gray and his second, and I have not been able to tell them, like, what was really taken out, what was deleted, how bad was it when it was first published. I haven't been able to tell them that because nobody knew. Those early documents were not made public until just a couple of years ago in 2011, and a student last year was kind enough to let me borrow his uncensored edition of Dorian Gray, and I'm in the middle of reading it right now, and it's really fascinating, and I'll have to let you know about some of those specific changes as we go through the novel. So why this theme about homosexuality? Well, you have a bit of a love triangle between three main characters. You have Basil the painter, you have Dorian Gray himself, and Lord Henry. And Basil and Dorian have a working relationship, but also in Basil's mind, a friendship. And there is some pull there. There's some level of attraction between Basil and Dorian. More on Basil's side, poor guy. But Basil definitely doesn't want Lord Henry to be introduced to Dorian, and he is jealous. So there's a strange dynamic between these three characters. Some jealousy, some protectiveness, some ownership, some level of possessiveness between the three of them, particularly between Lord Henry and Basil and their relationship with Dorian. And Basil doesn't want to share Dorian at first, and he's worried about the influence that Lord Henry might have on him. So there's that dynamic going on, and so in early publications of the novel, there were some questionable passages about how Basil described his feelings for Dorian, and it sounded a little more passionate than perhaps you would expect a platonic friendship to be amongst two men, and certainly at this time it was not acceptable. So he had to make some changes. Oscar Wilde was a homosexual. Oscar Wilde's mother dressed him up like a little girl when he was very young, a lot of times because she wanted a daughter so badly. So it's any wonder that he had issues with his sexual identity. You could be thrown in jail for such a thing, and Oscar Wilde in fact was sentenced to 2 years hard labor for, quote, gross indecency, according to British laws. When you're talking about a dandy like Oscar Wilde was, hard labor was very taxing on him physically, and he was never quite the same and just died a few short years later. How did he come to be thrown in jail for that? Well, Oscar Wilde had a relationship with someone named Lord Alfred Douglas, who was nicknamed Bosie. Now, Bosie was much younger. Lord Henry and Dorian's relationship is very similar to Oscar Wilde's relationship with Bosie. Now, Bosie's dad was a guy named John Douglas. He was the Marquis de Queensberry, and the problem was that he was a big bully. This guy was not nice. And when he started to suspect that Oscar Wilde and Bosie were having a homosexual relationship, he did everything he could to keep them apart, and even was said to have been lurking outside the theater. If Oscar Wilde had a play opening, then Bosie would show up, or Bosie's dad would show up with his, bodyguards and threaten Oscar Wilde physically if he didn't cut ties with him. Because of all of this harassment that Oscar Wilde was receiving from Bosie's dad, he threatened a lawsuit, threatened him for libel, because he felt like he was ruining his reputation, even though it was correct, the assumption that they were having a romantic relationship. But Oscar Wilde's friends tried to dissuade him from suing Bosie's dad because they knew that the allegations were true, that he was gay. Oscar Wilde was kind of like Bosie's sugar daddy. Spoiled him relentlessly. If Bosie didn't get what he wanted, he threw horrible tantrums, and then a couple of days later they would get back together, they'd make up. So what happened to Oscar Wilde in court throughout this whole process? Unfortunately, they used his actual fiction against him. They used the picture of Dorian Gray and passages from that book as they questioned Oscar Wilde about his sexuality. And so, long story short, at the end of that trial, Bosey's father is not found guilty of libel, but in fact there is a warrant out for Oscar Wilde's arrest for gross indecency. What the novel suggests is that erotic attraction supersedes sexual orientation or gender. So Wilde really presents a world here where love and eroticism are based primarily on physical attraction, those aesthetic principles. Pure physical attraction regardless of orientation or preference or sex or gender. So what are some literary techniques in this book? Well, of course you have irony, you have situational, dramatic, verbal irony. You know what that is. Of course it's classified as a melodrama. This is a play, a short story, a novel that centers more on excessive emotion and plot and action rather than character development. But my favorite thing about The Picture of Dorian Gray has to be the aphorisms. So even after Wilde made these revisions and had it published a second time, even after taking out a lot of that sexually charged language, it was still considered an immoral book due to its portrayal of a decadent lifestyle as seen through the principles of aestheticism and the character of Lord Henry and Dorian Gray specifically. The principles of the aesthetic movement through aphorisms. And aphorisms are these short phrases that sound like universal truths, although they might not be universally true. On the surface, they might sound a little contradictory, kind of like a paradox. And Oscar Wilde, in fact, was clumped into a small group of writers who were considered the princes of paradox. He was one of them. An aphorism on the surface might sound like, you might scratch your head and be like, that sounds wrong. But take a closer look and you see some truth to it. One of my favorite Oscar Wilde quotes is, "Life is far too important to be taken seriously." On the surface that sounds very contradictory, but you see some truth in it upon closer examination. And this book is full of aphorisms like that that will make you scratch your head, that will make you think, that will make you wonder. And not necessarily doubt your own beliefs, but perhaps they will strengthen the beliefs that you already have. Perhaps they will make you question at least why you believe what you believe. These statements are really powerful, and I encourage you to jot them down, underline them, circle them, highlight them, whatever, as you go along, and especially they'll come in handy during your writing of your dialectical journals. But the aphorisms in this story are really fun to examine and explore. So keep track of them. Oh, I love this one. But beauty, real beauty, ends where an intellectual expression begins. Intellect is in itself a mode of exaggeration and destroys the harmony of any face. Love that one. And here is one that I'm sure you've heard before but didn't even know it was Oscar Wilde who said it first. There is only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that's not being talked about. Page 6 in your novel. So that is it for now. I hope I've given you just enough to put the book into historical, social, and cultural context for you to enhance your understanding. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. And in the meantime, happy reading! This was a time of great uncertainty because if you recall, Darwin was published. This was a time of great uncertainty because if you recall, Charles Darwin was published. Blah. I hate doing this.